So thanks everyone for coming. It's the end of the day, long day, and we're excited to get started.
Absolutely.
Today our talk is about the beauty of data analytics and balancing the public good that comes out of releasing open data sets, and then also protecting privacy. So it's a pretty hot subject. We've heard it in lots of keynotes today and yesterday, and just going over a responsible way of releasing open data sets while also getting the benefits of those data sets.
So a little bit about us. I'm Eugene, and as you can see by my picture, I love eating food, as many humans do. And I'm an IT security specialist at Geotab.
And I'm Emily. I like the outdoors, I love to bike, and I'm excited to be here because it's a subject that we've been quite passionate about in the last while. So Geotab, I'm sure you've seen this name too many times at this point. And Geotab has touched on the data analytics side and has been quite a leader in terms of publishing data openly to the public on data.geotab.com. To give kind of a quick overview, we're getting GPS points, we're getting driver behavior type of data, we're also getting engine data. Amazing insights can come out of that, and a few examples are as follows. So hazardous driving, Neil did mention this today. It's amazing that we're able to just look at intersections that are more hazardous than others, just based on GPS and telematics data. On the more ecological side of things, idling. We get to get insights on idling and environmental, kind of the direction we're going in. Are things really getting better, and so forth. Last but not least, this one's a pretty popular one, weather data. Who knew that from a telematics device, we could get highly accurate weather maps showing real-time weather or temperature information on the spot? Now, we're not the only ones diving into the beauty of data analytics and publishing open data sets. We're able to get census data online. There are countless open data sets available for you. Sports data, they're starting to put sensors in shoulder pads, for example, and publishing stats with a big data spin to it rather than just the manual stats we've been writing down. Twitter, GitHub, you can look at open data sets showing code repos and so forth, Reddit comments, and even housing information. These are all examples of people jumping on the open data set craze and the big data that we keep talking about. With that being said, with IoT growing, by 2020, we're looking at about over 30 billion devices connected to the internet. With every single internet connection, there's more data to get out of it. There's data being collected, stored, processed, and published in some cases. With that, we have about 2.7 zettabytes of data collected at this point. That's huge. That's not something I could ever even visualize. The most shocking part of this all, however, is that of those 2.7 zettabytes of data, 90% of it has been created in the last 2 years. What does that mean? That means that it's been creating faster and faster. So we're collecting exponentially more data as we go forward. And as we continue to dive into the IoT or Internet of Things, the data is just going to continue to pile and be a new goldmine of insights, such as the examples I've shown earlier. Now, on the data side of things, does anybody notice anything in common with these logos? Yes, not necessarily the greatest big data is great vibe anymore. So with these guys, they've had some issues with whether it meant that they were collecting or storing, but at some point there was a data breach. The issue right now is that we're dealing with about 20 data breaches per day on average. So that means that even if that whole big data idea is huge and providing great insights onto kind of leading the technology and the innovation, there's also an issue with how people are dealing with the data and a lack of responsibility or protection surrounding it.
So here we have a roadmap of where we're going to take you during this presentation, and we want you to take 3 main things from here. First is that open data is really a complex subject. It's not something simple. It's not something that you do as an afterthought, and it really requires a lot of foresight and planning to do. And it's also something we need to take responsibility for, something that can't take care of itself, and we should treat it like a product we're responsible for and ensure its integrity and safety. And finally, we want an overview of our framework that we've created for you guys. This is more of a guideline on how to approach releasing open data sets in a sensible and safe manner. So where do we start? Well, we can start with the different kinds of data in this idea of a data spectrum by the ODI, or the Open Data Initiative. It ranges from closed to shared to open, and we're going to focus more on shared and open data in this talk. Shared data is data that's available to a large group of people, but not the entire public. And it's available on a set of limited terms and conditions on the ways it can be used and what it can be used for. On the other hand, open data is available to everyone, the whole wide world and internet, for any use imaginable under the sun. And while we're aware that businesses traditionally focus on shared data, we're trying to encourage them to release more open data sets and to be more fluent and able to tackle these problems that come with releasing open data sets. So what happens to open data when we release it? Well, it's not released into a vacuum. It's not released into a silo. It's never alone. It enters into something called the open data ecosystem, just like this terrarium up there. There's all different kinds of actors and other types of data that will integrate and interact with your own. And this is part of the challenge, is expecting the unexpected, the unusual, and the unique recombination of your data with other kinds of data from unusual actors. People like you and me, to governments, other businesses, activists, and even hackers. And this unusual use of your data, this new recombination, is something that drives innovation. It's both a benefit, but it's also a curse. Sometimes it opens up new avenues for privacy breaches or unintended consequences when your data combines with another data set that might not have been curated so carefully.
And so what's the issue here? We have a data ecosystem that's super complex. However, a lot of ways to release data are more traditional, and the older way of things of doing it doesn't assess or look at that ecosystem of data out there. The issue with this is that it's very narrow, it's closed-minded, and it's a really one-size-fits-all solution. It focuses on removing only a particular set of variables, and then you're done for the day. The best way to explain the issues with this is to go through an example. In 2013, all the taxi trips and data was released to the general public. That's actually a really insightful data set. It was quite useful, and people were excited about it. They went through the traditional way and eliminated all the obvious things. Things such as the passenger and driver names, credit card information, and anything obvious that would breach privacy was removed. The issue here was that they didn't really analyze the rest of the data set. They didn't see how it could be recombined with existing data sets in order to get a privacy breach. So it was published, and all of a sudden, because of this ecosystem, Yellow Pages, Facebook, etc., GPS points were not removed. And GPS points were all of a sudden linked to a home address. So we're seeing trips between home addresses and places, and with Facebook, we figured out home addresses and linked it to an individual person. All of a sudden, this safe data set was able to show driver behavior. Things such as who's the regular at such strip club on such Tuesday nights. All of a sudden, this is a disaster. The data set doesn't have anything necessarily obvious in terms of privacy, but because it was recombined in a way with an existing data set, such as any type of home address or Yellow Pages repository, this was actually quite catastrophic for anybody that was captured in this data set.
So where can we go if we move away from this traditional privacy model that is kind of narrow and rigid? We can begin to think of privacy and this whole process of creating a data set as something we need to be proactive in terms of privacy. Taking a model or a framework like privacy by design, or making sure that we always include privacy from the beginning to the end of the life cycle of our data. Not something that's an afterthought, not something that gets tacked on at the end to satisfy a regulation or something. We want to make sure it's part of the mission statement of your data. Second, we want to make sure that they're responsible for the product, and we're always trying to take care of it and look out for it. It's like a little child. It can't defend itself, so we've got to look out for its best interests. And finally, we want to make sure that we're planning ahead. Like we mentioned, data is complex. There's a lot of moving parts in it. And we want to make sure that we have a plan for how we're going to address each and one of these items and ensure that privacy and security are fulfilled in our mission. And that leads us to our framework.
So we're finally at the spot where we tell you how to be responsible. How should a company or a business that collects data approach it and do it responsibly? Getting started, the first step is a baseline. There's 2 steps that we really want to establish at this point. The first is the end goal of this data set. What do you want to get out of it? Basically, determine a way to outline how useful this data set needs to be so that at the end you can measure it and see if you're reaching that goal. Secondly, the privacy surrounding it. You need to determine the minimum amount of privacy or the risk you're willing to accept. In this case, depending on how sensitive the nature of the data, you get to determine on what scale that risk you're accepting. Unfortunately, there is a trade-off between the privacy and the utility of a data. So for example, the most useful data out there is raw data. You can do anything you'd like to it, and everything is there. There's no limitations. The problem with raw data is that there's absolutely no privacy surrounding it. On the flip side, if you want the most private data that you can, well, that's no data. That's nothing published, right? So you got to go look at that trade-off and figure out where you sit and to what extent you want to publish it and transform it so that it's de-identified.
So speaking about de-identification, this is where you do the main work of it. And de-identification is just the process of making sure that your data is not identifiable, not linkable to a single person, and putting their identity in danger or in jeopardy. And there's many ways to go about this. So there are some steps to analysis. First, you want to get familiar with the data. You want to know and understand it. And this involves getting your big data team to really get comfortable with it, understand its uses, understand why someone might want to use it, and potentially why someone might want to abuse it. And from there on in, you can begin to identify threats and vulnerabilities. Now, we've defined threats as something that comes from outside your data, something from the open data ecosystem. An actor or another data set that hasn't been properly de-identified, that has potentially harmful linkages to your own. You need to be able to accommodate for that and potentially remove parts of your data set to make sure that's not linked. Then, you want to set a desired level of de-identification, and we'll show you some categories shortly. And this is just a general sense of where you're going to go as a long-term plan so that you hit your goals in the baseline. From there, you're going to select and implement specific de-identification techniques, which we'll show you again in a couple slides. And finally, you want to reassess the impact of applying those techniques on your data. And each one will have a slightly different impact. And this kind of requires an expert because you need to know what you're actually doing to its usability and its privacy. So in the next slide, we have a 4-point model for de-identification categories. And at the top, you can see it's raw data. So it's the least de-identified. It's basically in its normal form. You're almost never going to release this. And that has the most general utility, but it has absolutely no privacy, as Emily mentioned. And moving downwards, we have more and more privacy and slightly more focused utility. So we have mass data. And this is data where you take those direct identifiers, people's first and last names or their home address, and you obscure them, you remove them, you do something to them to prevent people from taking that data and misusing it. And you can go a level further and get obscure data where direct and indirect identifiers are processed. Indirect identifiers being stuff like zip codes or emails, things that aren't necessarily linked to who you are as a person, but with the addition of other data like Facebook or some other rogue data set could be linked to yours and compromise the individual. And finally, you have aggregated data, where you combine multiple fields or rows so that it's a bit harder for someone to identify a single row from it or a single person, but you still get the general feel of the data. And this is something that Geotab does. We aggregate our data because it offers a very, very high level of privacy, while at the same time allowing us to have that very specific utility for the purposes that we want our data set for. And so moving on, we move on to the de-identification techniques. So there's a lot of them, more than actually fit on this slide. So we kind of grouped a bunch of them together into large-scale families, so it's easier to digest. So we have suppression, generalization, randomization, and statistical privacy. And all of these act and interact with your data in different ways. And unfortunately, there's no one technique that's like the best, that everyone has to use. It's all very much applied specifically to the context of your data and what type of data you have. Additionally, also, you need to understand what your end goal is. So this really requires an expert who's familiar with these types of privacy-saving techniques. And for example, if you wanted to apply it to a data set, you would need to know, let's say your data set is on fruit, and you have different kinds of fruit, apples, pears, oranges, and peaches. You couldn't apply randomization functions to it. Adding noise doesn't really make sense because that's meant for numerics. It's meant for like numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where you'd add a little bit of another number like 1.15 instead of 1 to kind of disguise your data a little bit and prevent direct re-identification. And this doesn't really work on fruit because you can't have 2.65 of a banana. You should eat the whole banana. And from there, you move on to evaluation of what you've done.
So at this stage of your framework, you have a data set that's processed. So one or many of the techniques that Eugene just mentioned would be applied to your data set and have impacted it in a certain way. That's why it was important in the baseline to have that utility threshold and the privacy threshold, because this is where you evaluate against it. So for example, if you aggregate your data so much, you actually might use the utility that you've set out in the start. So you got to evaluate that baseline and determine, is it still the usefulness, or is it still hitting the level of utility that you've defined at the start? If yes, great. Now, is it still hitting the level of privacy that was required in the start? Same thing. So at this stage in the game, you really want to evaluate and do a risk analysis and take a look at what level is your data at this stage, and if it's kind of passing that baseline that was established at the start. Now, very often, this point, you don't keep going. It's an iterative nature. So like this roller coaster, in most cases, you're going to loop-de-loop all the way back and reanalyze your data. The beauty of this framework is that it's not one size fits all. It's really reassessing the data set in particular and understanding the impact of those de-identification techniques and how it's going to deal with that ecosystem you release it into. Once you do pass this stage, however, once that baseline is complete, then you can move on to the release phase. Now, release seems pretty simple, but there's one thing to remember here. Release is not reversible. Much like a sink, or much like a water spout, you can turn it off, but you can't put the water back. So data, you can release it, you can delete where it's been released, but once it's been released, there's really no erasing it. So there's something to remember here is that it's not a reversible step, and it's not something you can take back very easily. Moving on. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
So finally, moving on to the last step, we have monitoring. And this is probably one of the longer steps where you continually do it until the end life cycle of your data. So just like this weird, skinny, tall animal, you have to be on guard. We have to look out for what threats there are in the environment once we've released the data and understanding what kinds of vulnerabilities our own data has. So you need reconnaissance into how the user is using your data, what they're using it for, not just for ill means or if they're looking to abuse it or misuse it on purpose or not, but also for potential positive uses where you can refine future data sets, where you can use that information to make a better product in the future. Additionally, you need intelligence into how the open data ecosystem is evolving and changing. And if somebody's releasing new data that might compromise yours, or if there's been a breach and a whole bunch of unfiltered data has just been dumped on the internet, you need to know that, and you need to have a contingency for dealing with that in regards to your own data. And you also need a system of alerts to keep you updated about what's happening. And yeah. And
so what better way than to take a look at this framework that seems so simple, but really it's loaded with analysis and you need lots of knowledge to back it up on. How would it apply to Geotab? So the best way to go through this, we will go very quickly on an overview of how Geotab's weather maps would be applied in this case. So for Geotab's sake, if you wanted to release a weather map and you wanted specific information of temperature at a certain area that's usable for a human, that's your utility right there. That's your threshold. So the question or the baseline in terms of utility here is this useful for a human to use in terms of getting accurate weather in real time at the right location? On the risk side, this is actually quite particular because the risk is extremely low, or the requirement is for the risk to be extremely low. That's because Geotab's first priority is their customers' privacy, and a breach would be absolutely disastrous in their case. And so at this point, the baseline is that the privacy is kind of the big important factor, and at all costs should be preserved, whereas utility is basically publishing something that's usable and useful for human use. Sorry.
No worries. So keeping in mind that when you move to analysis of this weather data set, you want to get your data scientists engaged with the data. You want them to understand it and use it and find uses for it and understand why the user and end use cases that exist for it, why they would happen. And once they're familiar and comfortable with it, you want to choose and select those data identification techniques that would suit both the nature of your data and the texture of your data, but also your baselines for risk and utility. So considering that we want very high privacy and very specific utility because it's just weather, we went with aggregation, and aggregation on a fairly high cell size level because we don't need very hyper-specific weather 3 feet away from you. You could just walk there. We can afford a larger cell size and a little bit more privacy due to that choice.
So moving on to the evaluation, in the case of aggregate data, the risk analysis was done, and it was determined that aggregation was actually the best way to preserve privacy in this case. Something to note, that's not a globalized statement, but in the particular case here, aggregate data with adequate cell size was the best way to reduce any type of risk. On the utility side, it actually helped a bit because instead of having an overloaded information of way too many points of data and too much overflow of information, aggregation actually helped in the utility because it was able to give a generalized temperature reading for a location. Onto the release, it was released onto data.geotab.com. This actually is supported by Big Data or Google BigQuery, and it has actually two particular aspects. The first is that although anybody can use this data set, nobody can use it anonymously. So this is a control that helps us track and determine whether or who is using the data. The second is that people have to accept that terms and condition. And so there is another control in place in order to prevent to have people just use the data maliciously or do something unintended. And so with the moving on to monitor, Eugene?
Yeah, so for monitoring, we can take the API usage of Google BigQuery and understand how our users or end users are using that data set and be aware of any potential misuse, whether intentional or not, and also be able to see those trends and how it's being used and what's most useful about that data. So for future data products, we'll be able to refine it and come to that conclusion of what best fits that utility much more quickly.
And so hopefully this slide looks familiar to you guys, but really coming to the end of our presentation, there are three aspects we really wanted to get across, and so that's why we'll say them twice. But the first is that data is complex. As much as we can give a framework in order to approach it, it's not one size fits all, and it's going to need a certain level of analysis throughout every stage. The second is that responsibility needs to be taken. Whether that means that you're collecting, storing, or even releasing data, whoever does so is directly responsible for it, much like a company is responsible for a product they release. Last but not least, hopefully you guys have a good idea of the overview of our framework, and so that you can really get an idea of how to approach the whole publishing data, but also protecting privacy throughout.
So we also wrote a paper, and it's a little more in-depth. Well, it's a lot more in-depth. We put a lot of hours into it, into writing it, and a lot of research. And we really hope that you'll all check it out and leave us some feedback, as our contact information is also on the blog post. By nature, we had to kind of condense it a lot for this presentation because we only have a half an hour, but we hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Maybe questions, like not link questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, so we're not going to do
It's
the
a small group.
connected questions. I think we're small enough. Oh, or we are.
I don't know. Someone has a laptop for us. Are there questions? Oh, okay.
Oh, awesome.
There.
Thanks.
Okay. I'll read the question. You want to
Sure,
tackle it?
we'll see.
Well, yeah, we'll both see. Okay. So our first question by Anonymous. Oh, they're so popular. How does Geotab do the monitoring? Is it an automated process or is it made manually?
So right now, we know that it's definitely on a manual side. We are moving towards automation just because it's much more scalable. But in terms of monitoring the use, it's actually quite unique because it's difficult to see how someone's using it. But there is some level of review being done on what's being released out, or findings that have been released outside of our data sets. So for example, if someone used our data set for something, there's monitoring for that. And then there's also monitoring the actual data sets themselves to ensure there's no additional vulnerabilities that are found. Okay. So next question, for security. There are companies that run scans to find vulnerabilities. Does it exist something similar applicable to privacy?
So we found, and the way we've interacted with, is that privacy and figuring out what can be made private and what constitutes privacy is much more a hands-on process. There's a lot of little details that go into it, and there's nothing like a vulnerability scanner that kind of does privacy on a whole data set. If it were so easy, we probably wouldn't need a framework. And it's honestly a lot of effort and man hours from people who are experts in the field who understand how these different things are going to be taken apart and disassembled and looked at. From a wide variety of backgrounds, from the non-technical to the very technical.
All right, did you want to?
Sure. Third question. How long has it taken Geotab to start planning using big data and been able to understand how to apply good practices for privacy? Did it require to take courses or certifications, et cetera?
So what's actually quite interesting is that we have a department devoted to the big data side of things. From data scientists to anybody else that's been studying in the field, we have experts working into it. And in terms of how long it's taken us to recognize the value of big data, Geotab's been using big data internally for very long, just because the level of risk here is a lot lower based on the fact that it's kept internal to Geotab employees. But for the open data set side of things, so data.geotab.com only recently got published or released. With that being said, Geotab's been around for more than a decade now, so Geotab has actually spent a long time preparing for this kind of release, just realizing that there is a lot at stake. And so as much as I can't give a specific timeline, we did go kind of the long route before publishing anything public.
We've had a lot of practice. I'll read the last question.
Okay.
What is the best document or post that can help a customer to feel secure when he realizes Geotab has public big data sets?
I would say the best way to start is to going to data.geotab.com. That's where everything data-related is going to be indexed for sure. And the privacy policy is also a great place to start in terms of understanding where Geotab stands and how they process data in the most private ways.
And it's available on the main site, I believe, as well as data.geotab.com. It's very visible because we do care a lot about it.
Yes.
And are there any more questions from people who would like to not be anonymous? No. All right.
All right. Well,
Thank
that
you all.
concludes our last presentation, so thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming.